So welcome to our program, and we know that you're a famous politician, the former Prime Minister of Australia, but why are you interested in water and sanitation and working for water and sanitation for all? What makes you interested in this issue? Usually politicians will be interested in politics and economics or finance.
Well, let me give you three answers to your question. I grew up on a farm in rural Australia where we had lots of water scarcity. And as a result of that, as a child, you develop a sense of how important water is in agriculture and also how important water is for simply domestic life. We had no hot water system. We had to boil water. We had no sanitation. No sewage system. So if you grew up in rural Australia in the 1960s, it gives you a very keen sense of the importance of water and sanitation in your own life. Secondly, as Prime Minister of Australia, we had to deal with big problems of water scarcity. And so we had to deal with our major river system, the Murray-Darling system, which in its total length is probably as long as the Huanghe. And so it's a big river system. But like the Huanghe, it actually is a very distressed river as well. And so we had to bring about a single river basin authority to improve the efficient use of water for agricultural uses, for industrial uses, for urban uses, and for the river itself. And so, therefore, in a position of national political leadership, I became directly engaged in water supply across the whole country. And secondly, also what we would do to improve water recycling. As you know, in China, you have lots of water abundance in southern China and lots of water scarcity in northern and northwestern China. I've been to your country more than 100 times. I've lived in China. And so you have a similar problem, in fact, to what we have in Australia. We have very dry parts of the country and have very wet parts of the country, but they're a long way from each other. So I became involved in that as a national political leader domestically. And then internationally, because of my work on the Sustainable Development Goals and my work on the high-level panel on global sustainability, which recommended the establishment of the SDGs, and then we saw the evolution of SDG 6, which relates specifically to water and sanitation. I delivered Australian aid programs in this area in various countries around the world, including Africa. And since I've left politics, UNICEF invited me to become chair of the Global Partnership on Sanitation and Water for All, which I'm pleased to do. But they're my three sort of sets of backgrounds for doing this.
But usually in this sector, in this water sector or sanitation sector, and that's always people complain is the most neglected sometimes. So it's not easy to get money. So in this sense, how do you finance that, or how why should the investors invest in this field?
Well, you're right. The SDG 6, I fear, is the poor cousin of the SDGs. And there are many reasons for that. One is a lack of national priority within various governments around the world. Number two, because it's so big, that is, providing safe drinking water and sanitation for all, when you've got billions of people in the world who have none, it's very expensive. And that causes politicians to say, it's too difficult, I'll just pretend it doesn't exist. So how do you find the finance, which is the second part of it?
So it's like a must, a fundamental issue.
It's a fundamental issue. It's a human right for all. But at the same time, human rights have to be paid for when it comes to access to water. So what are the sources of funding? Domestic finance from governments, good, but that means water pricing, usually. Secondly, you have access to the development banks within your countries and internationally for big projects. Thirdly, you also look at community financing and private financing for the capital which is necessary. You see, the amount of money involved in water and sanitation infrastructure is huge. It's in the trillions of dollars to make SDG 6 work. Therefore, our response is finance must come from all these sectors if we're going to fill the gap. Otherwise, it won't happen.
Mm-hmm. Then, when we talk about, we mentioned like a multi-stakeholder partnership. So then you say, yeah, all these sectors. But how should they cooperate to efficiently achieve the UN SDG?
Well, you're right to ask the question. It's one of the reasons why the Global Partnership for Sanitation and Water for All exists. Our job is to bring all the stakeholders together, globally and nationally, because it affects heads of government, it affects finance ministers, it affects sector ministers, it also affects local communities, it affects the technical community, it affects also those who are responsible for the delivery of programs in villages and communities. So unless we can bring all those together and form national plans to implement SDG 6, it won't happen. So our job as Sanitation and Water for All, SWA, SWA, is to help national governments, and there are about 50 of them in the world who have a problem, bring those national plans together and help them source the financing they need. That's what we're trying to do.
So are you confident that we'll achieve these goals
by
2030?
The Sustainable Development Goals were hard to write. They are particularly difficult to implement. So, will we get there by 2030? The reason I'm doing what I'm doing in the worst performing SDG of all, which is this one, is because I think there is a way to do it. It requires leadership, it requires some courage, it requires some imagination, it requires money, 没有钱没有办法. Then, but it also requires a very disciplined approach to implementing national action plans. Now, you in China are pretty good at this stuff because what you've done with rural development in China, even in some of the poorest provinces, you go to Ningxia, you go to Qinghai, you go to Xizang, where you've got real problems in getting water to some of these geographically isolated areas, or even down in Guangxi and places like that with sanitation. But you know, the government has been pretty consistent in rolling these programs out over time. Across the world and the developing world, it's been much harder than that. And so I think there's something to learn from China's experience, which is good, but we need finance. And I think China is also assisting in financing some of these projects, particularly in Africa, water projects, which are really important. But if China's finances this much for what the world needs, this is how much we need, and that's why we need all sources of finance to make a difference.
Thank you very much.